With Valentine's Day coming up, one of my favorite romantic myths is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So the film I'm going to review today that's based on Orpheus and Eurydice is the 1959 film Black Orpheus, which is a strange and interesting story set in Rio de Janeiro, of all places, and it's a retelling in modern times of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So what did I think? How did they handle this film? Just so you know, in pop culture, this film went on to be actually a very big success and is looked on very fondly. But from the Greek aspect, how do we see it and how do they handle the story? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And how do I see it? Does it really hold up in this year? Okay, so this is my review of Black Orpheus, which actually was released in 1959. It was also debuted and shown at Cannes Film Festival, or Cannes, however you like to say it, and has gone on to be a classic. So it is an interesting, for sure, take on the myth of Orpheus. So the story, as I mentioned, takes place in Brazil, and we follow Orfeo, or how it would translate to us as Orpheus. He's a streetcar conductor who works in Rio de Janeiro. So think of it kind of a modern translation in a way of the ancient myth. So we're dealing with a modern translation. Anyway, he's a streetcar conductor who is also a musician and guitarist. And tomorrow is Carnival, which is the big party they have in Rio, as we all know. Anyway, he's engaged to Mira, so much so that they're already picking out wedding rings and very much in a relationship, when all of a sudden a girl comes into town who happens to be Eurydice. And of course, just like the Greek myth, Orpheus falls in love with Eurydice and casts Mira, his fiancée, to the side to follow Eurydice, and they form this great relationship, and true love is found. This is a interesting movie, to say the least. The reason being, first off, it's a beautiful film that is set during the time of Carnival. So think of colors. It's just color everywhere, constant dancing and music. A film worthy of the name Orpheus, and to deal with the character. And they also, what I like, is that they do take the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and they translate it into a more realistic, modern kind of storytelling. So, with that said, it has a few confusing things in the story, even though it's set into a realistic setting in a way. They try to tell the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and use it as a more realistic movie, but they still have some supernatural elements to it. But what I do like about the film is that they do incorporate Greek mythology, having characters named after Greek gods and Greek characters. So the story unfolds the way it does in the classic myth, in a way. So Eurydice and Orpheus fall in love, and there's a little drama that's not explained with Eurydice's backstory. During Carnival, she has a man that she knows from her past, dressed as a skeleton, who is only called Death. And she's terrified of this person who is in a Carnival skeleton costume. They don't explain who he is other than he's going to kill her if he catches her. And just like the story, Eurydice does die. And how do they bridge the gap for Orpheus to go to the underworld and communicate with Eurydice, since this story is in a modern setting? in a more realistic setting. So, spoilers, what they decide to do in this story is that Eurydice is killed. You gotta watch the film to see how that happens. I don't want to spoil everything. So this death character, that's not explained who he is other than he's been stalking Eurydice, ends up being responsible for her death. And so, like in myth, Orpheus grieves for her. But they try to keep it in a more realistic, modern setting, so they still want to add a little bit of a spiritual element to it, because they want to still tell the story of how Eurydice speaks to Orpheus and how Orpheus sees her beyond the grave. So how do they do that in this film? While he's grieving for Eurydice, he meets up with this man who is the janitor while he's searching for the body of his girlfriend. And this janitor takes Orpheus to a voodoo ceremony. 100% what happens. It is a voodoo, and it's very much, if they don't tell you what it is, but you can only assume because of the nature of the ceremony. And so, and some of the gods they mention, I do believe, are voodoo. I do believe. Anyway, that's how they do the connection of Orpheus and Eurydice getting to speak to each other from beyond the grave. They don't go to the underworld like they did in classic myth, but they go to a voodoo ritual where Orpheus at first thinks this is strange. Why would this man bring me here? And then, but he's so desperate to talk to Eurydice again that he begins to join the ritual. And then all of a sudden he hears, by dancing and clapping and singing, that's why I'm doing this. And he begins to hear Eurydice's voice again. But, and just like in myth, he can't turn and look. And she warns him that you can't look at me or I'll be lost forever. How is he hearing her voice? I don't want to spoil it again. I want you guys to see this movie. But the same thing kind of plays out. So, and that leads to the end. So, he grieves again. It's a lot of confusing things. So he grieves again because he loses Eurydice for the second time. So he's able to go to the morgue. I want to talk about this because this was this strange. I don't know. I don't think this is legal in Brazil, or but he loses Eurydice again for the second time. Since I'm not going to spoil everything, I won't tell you everything, but I want to talk about this because he goes to the morgue where she is. He identifies the body, and then he is able to take her with him. So he picks up her dead body and walks her to their house, or his house. So yeah, he carries the body out of the morgue, and he takes her back home. And tragedy happens again. And something happens to the both of them, and the movie ends. And the very end of the movie is kind of something happens to Orpheus in the body of Eurydice, and they carry on like it didn't happen, which is another strange thing. I don't want to give away the complete ending, but there's just a lot of weird things that happen in this film. But overall, the Black Orpheus, I can see how it's a classic, how the music, the color, and it being a 1959 film, this version that I watched was in color, so that's probably the best way to really experience the Rio de Janeiro, the atmosphere, the constant music and dancing. It's a beautiful film to watch, and the acting is really well done. It leaves you with a bunch of questions, like, who is this death character that Eurydice had following her the whole film? They never explain that. Just weird things like, at the end when he takes her body, just walks it out of the morgue and walks it down the street and like it's nothing. And then the ultimate end of what happens to Orpheus and Eurydice at the end of the film, something happens, and then the children play like it was no big deal. It's just really strange. Maybe it's a foreign thing, or maybe Some things have not aged in certain parts as well as other things have. But overall, it is a really nice film. And I would say definitely check it out. If anything I've said sounds interesting or caught your ear, then you'd want to see this movie. Yeah, watched it on HBO Max, and I'm sure you can find it anywhere else. But if you guys have HBO Max, it's on there. And I say definitely check it out once, because it has, again, gone on to be actually real significant film, especially for Brazil. And it is subtitled because it is spoken in Portuguese. Either way, it's still worth checking out.